This is the Chucktown Wind Report Extended Outlook from Friday, July the 17th through Monday, July the 20th. So we talked about a frontal boundary in the last forecast that was going to bulge into the southeast region down through South Carolina and into possibly northern Georgia. And that's exactly what has happened, and that's mainly due in part by this ridge of high pressure which has been traveling from west to east across the northern tier along the jet stream to sort of funnel down a northeasterly flow down the coast behind this frontal boundary, and that's very typical. So what this kind of a boundary setup, when it bulges down and heads south, this is called a backdoor front. And as these backdoor fronts push through, these high pressures wedge down a cooler, sort of a more northeasterly flow behind it. And we'll get to that in a little bit, but those winds tend to increase as we get a little bit more into the cooler season. When we start transitioning from summer into fall, we'll see some of these high pressures to the north biting down a little harder and the winds actually picking up. But for today, we're having more of a moderate flow off of that. So let's talk about the frontal boundary now. We see a break in the frontal boundary here between these two segments, and that's mainly in part due to the northeast Gulf high pressure and very dry air funneling in from the west off of a large ridge that is built out to our west at the mid-levels. This is only surface level map, so our mid-level ridge of high pressure is going to be something larger to this tune. So with this dry air funneling in, it's dissipating and fizzling this frontal boundary out, so it's breaking it apart. And I think what's going to happen with the remnants of this boundary tomorrow morning is, as the day heats up, we have a large ridge building into the area, which is going to have a lot of sinking hot air. So we have another heat wave coming. Whatever's left of this boundary is going to lift as a warm front out of the area, and either that or dissipate altogether. And also with the Bermuda High building back in from the east, the Bermuda High is very far removed to the east right now. It's really more of an Azores High, and as the next couple of days, I think it's going to build back in, become more of a Bermuda Azores High, or even a simple Bermuda High when we get into Monday. So what this all means is basically we have this frontal boundary. We're seeing some cloud debris and clouding overhead. We could see a possible stray shower to pulse through the area. I'm not expecting very much in the way of thunderstorms. We could see a little bit of convection off of a short wave this afternoon, but I'm not expecting any widespread thunderstorming activity maybe until this weekend. But even with high pressure ridge building in from the west along a heat wave, we have so much sinking air that it's hard for thunderstorms to even develop because the air is just simply not able to lift. We could see a little bit on the sea breeze convergence zone inland. We may see a few clouds. I don't think that the lifting is going to be high enough to get those cloud tops high enough to be a thunderstorm activity or a strong convergence zone. So I think we're going to keep modest speeds through the weekend and then possibly get to moderate numbers on Monday. So the northeast Gulf Mexico surface high will keep the westerly west-southwest flow going up through Georgia and into South Carolina. And then we'll possibly have this northwesterly wind at night times for your land breezing heading towards the coast. But like I said, I don't see a lot of convergence this weekend because this heat is going to be causing so much air to sink from high pressure dome building over the area, and you got multiple high pressures as well. So you have high building in from here. You also have the northeast Gulf of Mexico high, and then you have the Bermuda high. So when you get a combination of these all in the same vicinity, they sort of create a trapping mechanism for the air, and it really just sinks more than it does lift for thunderstorming and increased sea breezes. So let's look at the tropics now. You see how far over this high pressure it's been very flattened by these frontal boundaries to the north of it. And you can see a frontal boundary here, another stationary boundary here, and so what you have is a flattened ridge of high pressure extending all the way across the northern Atlantic, and so your ridge axis is actually coming across over to this way. It's a very weak pattern. You can see the surface high here. This is for tomorrow, building over South Carolina. Then you have high pressure northeast Gulf of Mexico, and then you have the high pressures out in the Atlantic, and that all is going to create just a large dome of hot sinking air. So once again, not expecting much in the way of sea breeze. There's probably a south-southeast wind tomorrow, possibly going southerly on Sunday as this high builds back to the west and becomes a little bit more robust. And then as we get into Monday, we see that southerly synoptic flow start to build back into the coast again, where we actually get more of a sea breezing, a moderate sea breezing effect. So that's sort of the gist for our surface map readings. Now, if we look at radar right now, we can see a little bit of scatter on radar. There's not much of this moisture that's actually making it to the ground. I think it's so light it's probably evaporating before it hits the surface as the land is heating and the sun is popping through here and there. We see a couple little showers offshore of Charleston, maybe a little bit to our northeast. And like I said, we could see a misting here and there, maybe a quick sprinkle, but I don't think we're going to see much in the way of storms as this front is quickly dissipating and that drier air heading in from the west. So we do have an undercutting east-northeast flow in Charleston for right now. Take a quick look at the visible loop and stop it right there. And actually, I'm going to play this loop one more time. And you can see, watch the coastline, and you can see these clouds are really starting to dissipate along the coast as that east-northeast cut is forcing whatever low-level clouding there is inland. So let's go to our SPC mesoscale analysis, and there's a little, it looks like there's a little bit of a complication to our northeast right here, like a little bit of a low pressure starting to develop. I don't think it's going to be anything significant, but there again, anytime you have frontal boundaries to the south and high pressure to the north, it's always something to watch. Probably nothing there, but let's move on to Charleston, what's going on right now. So we have 11 knots at Folly Beach, we have 14 knots at Isle of Palms, 12 knots in the harbor. And what happens a lot of times is when we get these easterly flows, sometimes the land heating will actually cause what's called a backdoor sea breezing effect. So normally where we would see a southwest flow, let me turn on our editing tools here. Normally when you would see a south-southwest or southwest flow heading into the coast, and then you have your convergence zone developing here in the North Charleston area or even further inland, you see, these thunderstorm cloud tops lifting, and then you have this return flow out to the ocean and back into land, and that sort of gets that wind wheel going for our southerly sea breezes. But when we have northeast wind, what you actually have is cooler air funneling down from the north, and what that does is as it travels in along the coastline, land is heating and radiating air, it's lifting the air. This cooler air is more condensed and it's sinking, so what you end up having is a strong temperature gradient right along the coastline that allows those winds to accelerate. So it's not even a sea breeze circulation, even though it is considered a sea breeze. It's called more of an oscillation, and that's what gets our winds really cranking along the coast when you have these the warmer land, the cooler air, the mix between the two right along the coastline is where you see some of these strongest numbers, because that's the first contact this air is having with the land, and that's your land and sea interface, and that happens at the north end of Folly Beach as well. Right along Morris Island. As we get into the harbor, we see the wind sort of refract back in through. It funnels in through the harbor around the land, so it sort of steers in between the land masses, and that's what causes it to turn an extra cardinal direction to the east-southeast when we get an easterly flow, and even an east flow when we have east-northeast along the coastline. So that's kind of how that works. I'll do another segment on that another time in detail, but for right now I'm expecting these numbers to stay about the same for today. I don't see much more than 14-15 knots for this afternoon. Maybe 2-3 o'clock during peak heating we could see a small surge to 15 and maybe a pulse to 16 knots before it quickly fades out to the low teens and even single digits by this evening as the air temperatures start to cool and everything sort of evens out. So let's take a quick look at the modeling for the pier, and let's select all, see what it reads. I think you're going to see a lot of agreement on models today as they sort of populate what's going to happen with this east-northeast wind leaning east and then fading. And you can see the jump right here this morning where the winds actually turned at about 7:45. It looks like about 7:45 this morning, where that jump is in the wind. That's where the land heated up enough to actually pull the wind around and steer it onshore, and so you see that huge jump. And other days when that high pressure is stronger to the north, it's a very modest high pressure ridge to the north, by the way. When you get a really strong Canadian high, that wind will jump really far up and you'll see these wind speeds really turn on, but we don't have enough strength today. But there is a lot of model agreement to stick around 10 knots to low teens for this afternoon and then fade out. As you can see, the models are all trending towards the east-southeast flow and fading out as the day goes on. And that's going to be the trend. And if we want to look at the north to see a further trend for what could occur later, if we get a stronger gradient in the area, we can see Winyah Bay, and that's at 15 knots, and that's more of a north-northeast flow. That's probably in association with that tricky little low off the coast, keeping things offshore. up that way. So I don't think we're going to see very much more than that at Winyah Bay. That area could pulse to 17 knots between 2 and 3 p.m. But I'm not expecting too much more today from the sea breeze, backdoor sea breezing along Charleston because of the weakness of the high pressure to the north. So let's recap here. So for right now, I'm thinking we'll have an east-northeast, somewhat moderate flow today, maybe peaking out around 15-16 knots before fading. As we get into the weekend, we start to see more of a southerly flow coming from the Bermuda high pressure that builds back into this area, and we could see a southeast or a south flow, very mild, very modest, around 10 knots, maybe low teens peaks. It gets a little bit stronger into Sunday. I would say low teens peaks, max maybe 10 to 14 or 11 to 15 knots, and then by the time we get into Monday, we see a more robust Bermuda high pressure develop where we start to see mid-teens populate again, so 13 to 17 knots on Monday, south-southwest winds. And that will do it for the Chucktown wind report, and have a good weekend.